And go ahead.
So it all began when my great-grandmother was born in Panama in 1929. She was born in Panama and then eventually moved to Argentina, where she grew up. There, she met my great-grandfather, where they settled down, and eventually they moved back to Panama, and they made a family. Right, so I guess they kind of settled down more in Panama. Anyway, they popped 3 kids out, and by that time it was 1950, and that was when my grandmother and my great uncle were all born. After that, they moved to Venezuela, where my grandmother and her siblings all grew up, and then she went to Catholic school. And by the time that my great-grandfather kind of decided to like dip out of the picture, he had gone to the United States to do draftsmanship for NASA, and my great-grandmother brought my grandmother to Mexico City, where she spent a lot of her time like growing up, coming of age, that sort of thing. And then eventually, when my grandmother was a young adult, and my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather had split, eventually my grandmother came to America, to Florida, where NASA is based, because she had a relationship with her father, my great-grandfather. And they didn't end up spending a lot of time together, and my great-grandfather was kind of like, he was off doing his own thing, and my grandmother found work in the corners in Florida. That's where she met my grandfather, who was a passerby, just kind of, visiting the United States from Germany, where he had the last name Caldera, but was going by a different last name, Langschwager. He met my grandmother, they fooled around, and then by the time that my father was conceived, he didn't want to stick around for any kind of like parenthood trap kind of thing. And so he wanted my grandmother to get rid of my father. She was adamant about keeping him. I have never ever even met my grandfather to this day, because of course he wasn't going to stick around for that. And that's how my father was born. Eventually my father, after growing up in Florida, had moved to Pennsylvania, and that's where he met my mother, who is also, ironically, had grown up in Florida. They started a happy little family with 4 kids, and a whole lot of other stuff happened, but that is the story about how my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my father came to the United States and started a family.
That's awesome. Okay, so your great grandmother was born in Panama, and she moved to Argentina, where she met your great grandfather. And then they moved back to Panama, and they had kids. Three? Three kids. And one of them was obviously your grandmother, and she moved to Venezuela and then Mexico City. In Mexico City, that was where she kind of grew up and became an adult and did her thing there for a while. And then she moved. No, that's where she was doing her own thing, being a little, working the corners. And Then she moved to Florida. Then she was doing her little thing. And that's where she met your grandfather, but he was just visiting from Germany, and he was actually going under a different last name, which is really interesting. And so then she got pregnant, and he wasn't really down to hang around, so I don't know if he dipped at that point. I guess she was adamant she wanted to have your father. So she did that on her own. He dipped out, and that's how your father was born, and they were in Florida. Then your father moved to Pennsylvania, and at that point he had last name Langschwager, and he met your mother, who was also from Florida originally, but they met in Pennsylvania. And then they had you and your three siblings, and that is the happy little story of the Langschwager family. I love that. It's so interesting. I started recording again just because I think this is so fascinating. Is there anything else? I might not add it if you don't want me to, of course. But
no, absolutely.
Is there anything else you want to add? Because there's just so many interesting... Oh, so my original question that I didn't get recorded was, how did this get passed down to Patrick as far as these stories go? So who did you... So you knew your great-grandmother, which is fascinating to me because I only know a little bit about even my grandparents. So tell me more about how you've heard all these stories.
Well, by the time that I met my great-grandmother, I think I was like 4 or 5, 6. Like I was very young. And I mean, I'd known her since I was born because she'd always been there and everything. But she passed away, I believe, in 2015. Anyway, when I was a kid, she was always very grumpy, but she would always inspire me to do art. She would get me all these different art supplies and art materials and things. But she's always very grumpy, and she's doesn't want anything to do with anybody. She's stuck in this nursing home in Center City, Philadelphia. Where she's at the end of her life, and she's still kicking and she's not exactly happy or sad about it, but like she's just kind of there. And so
Interesting.
that was my great grandmother, and I was just always like, wow, this is kind of an unpleasant time.
Mm,
But by the time that I came out and I came out to my grandmother, that's when I think I started learning a little bit more about the story,
mm,
when my grandmother told me, oh yeah, no, like you're gay, like of course you are, like I've always known that.
mm.
This has been obvious to especially me, since I grew up with Grandma Angie, who is like a butch lesbian. She's like, my mom's a
Amazing.
butch lesbian, and I was just like,
Oh, so you didn't know that?
I was like, what? All this time? She's like,
Wow.
yeah. She's like, yeah, no, grandma. She's like, yeah. Um,
Wow.
and apparently, like, there was, so grandma had already gone through all the stages of her family being gay, being a
Right.
member of the
What
LGBTQ
do you know
community.
what year that was she out and like was that a thing when she got divorced? Were they were divorced, right?
Yeah, I mean, they got divorced, they went their separate ways, and my great grandmother became her own person. So by the time that I found this out, I was like, wow, this is so interesting. And I ended up doing this research project where we had to like, find out more about our family history.
Ooh,
I think it was like for English class or something, and then we had to like tell the story up front. Probably very similar to this.
that's fascinating.
Um,
So you got to like dig into that
I
personally.
did. And so my grandmother told me about her time after she was born in Panama and they had moved to Venezuela.
Hmm.
And she would tell me about how she would love to visit her father and see how, the artwork that her father was working on, because apparently he also did like advertising work, which I think
Oh
is very
wow.
interesting.
Wow. And will you tell me a little more? You had mentioned earlier, but I just wanted to get it. Like, how did their cultures affect your life growing up as far as, you know, language and food and stuff?
Um, how did it affect me? I mean,
Right, like how were you immersed in that or was it more of like this like their past history and they'd moved on and kind of assimilated and
yeah, they had moved on, they had assimilated, life was intrinsically different, I think, for both my great grandmother and my grandmother, who were the only real people in my life that, in my family that were from, you know Mexico and Central America.
wow.
you know
It's a wonderful
uh,
story and it's so awesome. I think it's so awesome, at least from my perspective, to like know that stuff because all I know is what my grandparents did for a living. I don't really know much else than that. So it's so cool you have this interesting story and you also are able to pass it on like firsthand. Like you have the firsthand story of it, not just only being passed down. It's really awesome.
yeah. And it's interesting because like there's still this like curious question of like, how am I and my siblings, how are we all so white when like, you know but the answer is that my great grandmother was only half Central American, only half Latina.
Interesting.
So by the time that she had met this European guy from Germany,
Mm.
so then my grandmother is only a quarter Latina,
Okay.
even
Interesting.
though she had grown up in Central America, which would make my dad 1/8 Latino, which would make me like 1/16 Latino.
Right. Interesting. Now, have
So
you seen photos? Were they like people of color or were they white Hispanics?
my great grandmother was a person of color, and she had shared part of her family history on, I guess, my great grandmother's mother's side, with Native American.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So she was
Fascinating.
like, yeah, she was like Native American and Hispanic.
Got it.
Yeah.